But on behalf of the Harvard Club of Southern California, I want to thank you for joining us at this Harvard Speak LA virtual event. The Harvard Club of Southern California is one of the largest and most active Harvard alumni clubs in the world, and we're delighted to be able to sponsor this event. My name is Neil Morgenbesser. I'm Harvard College class of '86 and the director of the Harvard Speak LA program, which brings the opportunity to the broader alumni community for some intellectually and academically stimulating interactions with some of the most renowned Harvard faculty members. Our 2025 talks so far have included Dr. Loretta Mickley on wildfires, astronomy professor Avi Loeb on evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, law school professor Randall Kennedy on the demise of Jim Crow, retired government professor Harvey Mansfield on conservatism at Harvard, philosophy professor Ned Hall on how to build a culture of intellectual vitality at Harvard, government and sociology professor Theda Skocpol on America's democracy and governing crisis, and genetics professor Joel Hirschhorn on how genes affect our height, weight, and other things we care about. Today, we're extremely excited to be able to hear from national best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize winner, Professor Stephen Greenblatt. Professor Greenblatt is Kogan University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. His research focuses on Shakespeare and Renaissance literature. He's interested in the social and historical embeddedness of cultural life and is best known for a critical practice known as New Historicism. Professor Greenblatt is the author of 12 books, including The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, for which he won the 2011 National Book Award and 2012 Pulitzer Prize, and Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare, which spent 9 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. His honors include, well, maybe more than I should read, the 2016 Holberg Prize from the Norwegian Parliament, MLA's James Russell Lowell Prize twice, Harvard University's Cabot Fellowship, the Distinguished Humanist Award from the Mellon Foundation, Yale's Wilbur Cross Medal, the William Shakespeare Award for Classical Theater, the Erasmus Institute Prize, 2 Guggenheim Fellowships, and the Distinguished Teaching Award from the University of California, Berkeley. Among his named lecture series are the Adorno Lectures in Frankfurt, the University Lectures at Princeton, the Clarendon Lectures at Oxford, and he's held visiting professorships at universities in Beijing, Kyoto, London, Paris, Florence, Turin, Trieste, and Bologna, as well as the Renaissance residency at the American Academy in Rome. He was president of the Modern Language Association of America and is a permanent fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. He has been elected to membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy of Letters, and the American Philosophical Society. Professor Greenblatt has recently published his newest book, Dark Renaissance, The Dangerous Times and Fatal Genius of Shakespeare's Greatest Rival, about Christopher Marlowe. The title of Professor Greenblatt's talk today is Dancing with the Devil. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll kick it off by thanking you, Professor Greenblatt, for joining us and asking why Dancing with the Devil and why Christopher Marlowe?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and very nice to see you all. I'm delighted to have this opportunity. Where shall I start? Let me start by saying that now, quite a few years ago, I was trained as a literary critic at that other university in New Haven, Connecticut, in the heyday of something called New Criticism, which many of you may recognize the term. It referred to a quite powerful literary method that was dominant in those days, that said that you should study literature without reference to the author, the intention of the author, the history, the setting, nothing, and also not in relation even to your emotional responses to the work. You should study
the Zoom meeting, and then I'll see you tomorrow at 10.
Okay.
And then
Tomorrow.
Hey guys.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. You should study it only in relation to you should analyze the internal structure of the work, its rhetorical structure, its tissue of ambiguities, and so forth and so on. That's how I was trained, and it actually is a method that has a real relevance at the moment because, in effect, with the advent of generative AI, we could actually say, I think that this would be the method if you actually believe in generative AI, because from the point of view of New Criticism, it doesn't matter if a work was written by a machine or written by a human being. All you need to do is to analyze its internal structure. Okay. But I rebelled against this idea back in the day when I was a student, and I resist it now. And I do so because I was interested in the life experience of the people who wrote the history of the nature of the world out of which the works come, and for that matter, the nature of the world in which we receive these works, such as right now. So that's the general picture. Christopher Marlowe. Now I really am speaking like an English professor. Christopher Marlowe uh, was the person who introduced theatrical, dramatic blank verse, that's to say, unrhymed iambic pentameter, that swept the field almost immediately in Elizabethan theater, became the principal medium for Elizabethan theater, and became Shakespeare's principal medium. So from the point of view of strict analysis, literary analysis of the kind that I learned how to do at Yale, that's all you need to know. You need to focus on that blank verse. But in fact, as I said, I bit the hand that fed me. I rebelled against this when I was a graduate student, and I dislike it now because I think that, though I think it's fascinating that he came to figure this extraordinary thing out, that's only a technical device. What is fascinating is the world from which this particular device came and the life out of which it came. And that takes us into the life of Christopher Marlowe. I'll come back to the question of Dancing with the Devil. But just to say that back in the 1990s, when I was teaching at Berkeley, I had a call from someone who identified himself as a screenwriter in Southern California, Mark Norman. Maybe some of you actually know him. I doubt it, but maybe you do. And he said he was thinking about writing a movie based on Amadeus, a biopic about Shakespeare, and he'd love to pick my brain. And he'd take me to lunch at Chez Panisse. I said, that would be great. So he flew up. We had a very nice lunch. And I said, listen, Mark, you shouldn't write a biopic about Shakespeare. Shakespeare's life was not very interesting. This was before I wrote my biography of Shakespeare. I now think Shakespeare's life was incredibly interesting, but putting that aside, I said Shakespeare's life isn't interesting, that we should write a biopic about Christopher Marlowe. That's an unbelievable life. And he laughed and said, no, it had to be about Shakespeare. And so we kicked around some ideas. And then he came back a second time and took me out for another fancy, this time for dinner. And I said, look, the only thing I can think is that you could have Shakespeare, since it's likely that Shakespeare was at least bisexual and Marlowe was certainly almost exclusively homosexual. You could have Shakespeare and Marlowe have an affair, and then you can shift it over to a movie about Marlowe. And he laughed at me and said, forget about it. He's hoping to get money from the Disney Corporation. And this was hopeless. So we went back and forth. And in the end, he sent me a script, in fact, but I was very busy, didn't get around to do it, to look at it. And the joke was on me, because Mark Norman was the screenwriter who teamed up with Tom Stoppard and wrote the screenplay for Shakespeare in Love, which was a terrific movie. I mean, and I think lots of fun. But I held on to the idea that Marlowe's was the life that was worth actually thinking about, trying to understand, because it's such a strange life and such a poignant and powerful life. So that was floating around in my mind from the 1990s, Neil, but I didn't do anything about it. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I thought, well, maybe this is the moment to think about Christopher Marlowe and try to figure out something about that strange, tragic life. That's part of an answer. And the question of Dancing with the Devil, I think we'll get into that. But just to remind people who are on that Marlowe's most famous play, in many ways his greatest play, is Dr. Faustus, about someone who makes a deal with the devil. But we'll come back to how that works for Marlowe.
Got it. Okay, so let's set the stage, because one of the things I took away from the book was that Marlowe was pivotal in bringing Renaissance to England in a way that I guess I had always thought Henry VII was a Renaissance king. And so you make a different point, which is there was a lot of medieval holdover for quite some time, and it was not a very hospitable environment for free thinkers. Machiavelli was banned, et cetera, et cetera. So give us a little bit of that flavor and how pivotal was Marlowe, in his own right as a revolutionary figure.
Well, Marlowe was born in 1564, as was his almost exact contemporary Shakespeare. And the world into which he was born, it wasn't so much that it was medieval, because it had, as you suggested, it already under Henry VIII had made a break from Rome and so forth. But it was a wasteland culturally. It hadn't been a wasteland in the early part of the 16th century. There were several wonderful poets under Henry VIII, Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. But Henry VIII had the Earl of Surrey executed, and he suspected Thomas Wyatt of having had an affair with Anne Boleyn. So Thomas Wyatt survived, but he had several long imprisonments. And basically, after they died, England went from Catholic to Protestant, back to Catholic, back to Protestant again. And each time that the regime changed, there was bloodletting, persecution, and basically that level of disruption and produced an atmosphere of fear. So that by the mid-16th century, there was basically nothing going on culturally in England that we would care about. Of course, there are always some writers, always some painters and sculptors, but nothing interesting was happening. If you try to think who are the writers from the mid-16th century, you come up with the names of several poets whom I've read because I'm in the business, but I can assure you no one outside of the business has read. And that's the world into which Marlowe and Shakespeare were born. In the 1570s, something happened in England quite interesting, and that isn't Marlowe's doing. A set of entrepreneurs and actually from the carpentry trade built a theater in London, and it was successful. And then there was another theater built in because it was making the theater was making money. They came up with a fantastic idea, which was that they charged for the entertainment before the people saw the entertainment, as opposed to passing the hat afterwards. And that changed everything. That's why we have the phrase box office, because they had a box you had to put the money in when you entered the theater. It was a brilliant idea. The things that were performed in that theater in the 1570s and early 80s are terrible. We have some of them, most of them not, because they just weren't ever printed. But the ones we have are look to us quite crude. But they were successful. They brought in money to the entrepreneurs. So that was something that was actually happening in England, but it was, as it were, waiting to be set on fire by someone with gifts. And Marlowe is the person, unquestionably, who actually lit the fire and made the theater take off.
And how much of that is his personality, his background? I mean, you have him being he's very transgressive, right? You have homosexuality, you have atheism, you have all sorts of forbidden messages. Was that something that came naturally to him, or was that something he did almost for effect, or is it a combination?
I mean, he walked very close to the wild side, to the edge. Behind your question is something that is extremely difficult to determine. Was he being a deliberate provocateur? Was he asked to be a deliberate provocateur? And we don't know the answer to this. What we do know is that he had a rather short run of it. So if this was part of a plan, it was a plan that didn't lead to a long, happy life.
So, yeah, the most intriguing or surprising part of it was the whole espionage angle. He was a spy. So,
well, as far as we know, I mean, what happened was Marlowe comes from a very, very, to call it a modest background is a euphemism. It's trailer trash from the town of Canterbury. His father was in trouble for beating up his apprentice and drawing blood. His sister attacks people in the street. Their family's illiterate. Marlowe, for reasons that we don't really know, I have speculations, managed somehow to learn enough Latin to get admitted to the best school in Canterbury, though no one else in his family, as I said, was literate. And then from there, he got a scholarship to go to Corpus Christi College, Cambridge University. And those scholarships for very poor boys like Marlowe were meant basically to train worthy young men for the Anglican priesthood. Because after the break from Rome, after the rendering of Catholicism illegal, in the worship, Catholic worship illegal in England, there was a need for the Catholic priests were all gone. There was a need for Anglican priests. So they had a certain number of scholarships for poor boys. And Marlowe was the recipient of one of these. And at the end, he got his BA degree, and then he went on for an MA degree. And when he applied, he filed the papers to be given his diploma after 6 years that he had spent at Cambridge. The Cambridge authorities denied him his degree. They said he hadn't fulfilled the residence requirement. And they suspected that during his long absences from Cambridge, he had gone to France, where they were training young dissident English Catholics to smuggle them back into the country and to serve the faithful, and also, as the government thought, to try to kill the Queen and bring Catholicism back to England. So they said no degree, and you can actually confirm that he was absent for long stretches of time in those second 3 years at Cambridge. The way you can confirm it is the colleges kept something called buttery books, in which they kept track of the beer and food that the students were eating every day, and they entered the students' names. And so you can see when Marlowe was there buying beer and food, and when he was missing. And there are long periods of time in which he was missing, and when he comes back, he seems to have more money in his pocket, buys more beer and more food. Okay, so Marlowe was denied his degree, and then a month passed, and then lo and behold, a letter was sent from the government, from the most important people in the government. It would be like a letter signed by every member of the president's cabinet. And the letter, signed by the members of the Privy Council, as it was called, said that Her Majesty would be very unhappy if someone who had done the state such service as young Marlowe were to be penalized and not receive his degree, give him his degree. And surprise, surprise, the Cambridge authorities gave him his degree. So the very clear, they discreetly don't say what it was he was doing to serve the country. But you can be sure, Neil, that there aren't many letters written for cobbler's sons from the members of the Privy Council interfering with the affairs of Cambridge University. And it's almost certain, and we can confirm this from later evidence from Marlowe's life, that he'd been recruited for the spy service, which was being run by a man named Francis Walsingham from his office in London.
And then some of these characters show up at the end and play a role in his death.
Exactly. Many of the people whom he's involved with for his whole life, not only the people at the very end, but various people along the way. The person he rooms with in London actually gets involved in a murder. The people he rooms with when he goes to the Netherlands are all people involved in one way or another in the Secret Service.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. But I think part of the excitement about him and the book is also the sort of shadow lurking on the side, which is Shakespeare. And what's the influence and what's the interaction? And I guess I was surprised to learn they were almost identical birth dates. And so they were almost identical contemporaries, and that they had collaborated. I mean, you say that modern scholarship seems to indicate that Henry VI was a joint effort. And so you engage in some speculation about what it might have been like, but I think that is, that's where things get almost electrical when you're reading the book.
The book, I mean, the book as you know, Neil, I've read it. The book is of course inevitably filled with speculation. I'm very careful to use the words might have, could have, possibly, to signal the fact that I'm speculating. But Shakespeare and Marlowe are in London and working in London at the same time for the same people. It's always possible, like a French farce, that one of them walked in the door at the same moment the other one walked out the door. But it's exceedingly unlikely. And now, as you've mentioned, the new editors of the Oxford Shakespeare say that Henry VI parts 2 and 3 were written by Shakespeare and Marlowe together. And look, they're from rather similar backgrounds, except that Shakespeare's father was a glover, Marlowe's a cobbler, and Shakespeare's father was a more important figure than Marlowe's father. Shakespeare's father was the equivalent of mayor of Stratford, but still from a modest middle-class background. Marlowe went to university. Shakespeare didn't go to university. If Shakespeare had died at the age of 29, which is when Marlowe was killed, if Shakespeare died at the age of 29, we would think of Shakespeare as, who's that guy? He's the author of that slasher play, Titus Andronicus, and also of that mediocre comedy called Two Gentlemen of Verona. And he also, didn't he write, maybe, I can't think of something else he wrote, maybe, those history plays, Henry VI, parts 2 and 3, which he wrote with Marlowe. That is to say, he wouldn't count at all for us, except for people like me. Everything in Shakespeare's career basically follows in the wake of Marlowe's death. Shakespeare sort of exploded with talent just after Marlowe died. And maybe it's not entirely coincidental.
Yeah. You do pick up on the fact that Shakespeare responded almost to everything that Marlowe did. You make the connection between Tamerlane to Titus Andronicus, Edward II to Richard II, Jew of Malta to Merchant of Venice. I guess one question, even the poetry, one question I have is, what about Faust? What about Dr. Faustus? Did Shakespeare respond to that? Was that Marlowe's greatest work? I mean, how do we think about that?
Marlowe's Dr. Faustus was a work situated in a world that Shakespeare, at that point in his life particularly, didn't really know at all. Marlowe had gone to university, knew what it was to be a scholar in his study. Now, Shakespeare had a big imagination and could have conjured that up the same way he conjured up lots of things he didn't know. But I think it's quite interesting that in that history of responses, which would also include Shakespeare writing Richard II after Marlowe wrote Edward II and so forth, there isn't a direct and immediate follow-up. There are two ways in which I think Shakespeare does follow up on Dr. Faustus. One way in which he follows up has to do with the fact that Marlowe in Dr. Faustus invented something, again, that hadn't been seen before on the English stage. And that has to do with the soliloquy in which someone reveals the torment inside him, the troubled thoughts inside him. For anyone who happens to know Marlowe's play, it begins with Faustus in his study, brooding about having reached the end of all that he has mastered and longing for something more, and tormented. And Shakespeare actually, you can see that Shakespeare picks up some hints for how to do this, and he actually goes considerably beyond what Marlowe was able to do in Hamlet in 1599, 1600. And then again, close to the end of Shakespeare's career, he finally does, in effect, conjure up Dr. Faustus, the scholar, the person who's learned how to conjure up magic from his books, and that's Prospero and the Tempest. But of course,
Mhm.
Prospero doesn't make a deal with the devil. Prospero is the good Magus, as opposed to the witch Sycorax in that play.
Okay. Well, I mean, we could talk about the book forever, but I'm going to switch gears. But I paid retail for it, which, is not something I ever do. So I'm pleased. So I recommend you all go out and buy it now. Let me switch though to maybe a little bit about you and then a little bit about what's going on at Harvard. So how does one become a Shakespeare scholar? I mean, what possessed you, and how did your life take this turn?
Well, I was I was going to be a lawyer, first of all, originally, and I applied to law school and got in, I'm happy to say. But I asked the law school to defer me for a year because I wanted a Fulbright to go to Cambridge after I graduated from college. And then I started to go back and forth. I started to read uh, uh, English literature at Cambridge, which I had read also at Yale, and got more and more engaged in it. And at a certain point, I got a renewal of my Fulbright, and I got a letter from, it was Yale Law School I was going to go to, that said that they would give me another year. And I was in Istanbul on one of those crazy long vacations that the English academic calendar has, and I had the law school and the Fulbright in my hand, and I knew if I took another year in England in the Fulbright, I probably wasn't going to go to law school, and I impulsively tore up and threw away the law school and decided to go to graduate school and get a PhD. I should add, so I don't make this too romantic and heroic, that those were the days in which there were lots of jobs for English professors, of which there are virtually none these days. So it wasn't much of a risky decision. And then I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Sir Walter Raleigh, not on Shakespeare. But if you work in the Renaissance, as I did, Shakespeare is the enormous sun around which everything else circulates and eventually get pulled into its orbit. So for me, it was quite easy to get pulled in that direction.
Got it. Okay, I got a couple more questions, and then people can also chime in with questions. If you do have questions, you can enter them into the chat, and I'll take them one by one. But let me just start with a focus on humanities at Harvard, and then we'll talk more broadly about what's going on at Harvard. So humanities at Harvard, we read a lot about, is it in trouble? Is it getting the attention it deserves? Is it getting the students it deserves? Is it getting the funding it deserves? So what's your perspective on the health of the humanities at Harvard? And then we'll talk about the health of Harvard and the broader society.
I have fairly upbeat account of the humanities at Harvard. I've taught at Harvard now for 27 years. Of course, there was a slow and then not so slow decline in the number of humanities concentrators at Harvard, and as there has been virtually at all other institutions, not entirely surprising, as applied math, for example, became a more and more powerful concentration, and various other technical, scientific, and technological concentrations. That made a lot of sense. But the numbers of students taking humanities courses in general didn't decline as rapidly. It's just the number of concentrators diminished. And as I say, to me, it made a reasonable amount of sense that it was going to diminish. And I was disappointed, of course, maybe a little bit. It didn't shock me particularly because the engagement by the students on the whole has been very good. I started a course now, maybe 15 years ago, with a colleague of mine, Luke Benand, that some of you may read because he writes regularly for the New Yorker, a freshman humanities course that's effectively a kind of great books course, but we don't call it that, called Hum 10. And when we first proposed the course to the person who was then the humanities dean, she, at the time, was disappointed because it didn't sound hip enough to her. It sounded very conventional. So we start with Homer and we work our way up through Sophocles and Dante and Shakespeare and so on and so on, eventually to Joyce. And so she said, all right, I'll let you teach it, but you have to cap the class at 38 students. So we said, fine. And so the first year we had maybe 50 students who tried to get in. The second year, maybe 70 students who tried to get in. The third year, the humanities dean's boss called us in and said, "What are you doing turning away all these students?" We said, "Well, we were told to be capped at 38." He said, "No, no, forget this. I mean, you know," and so we built the course up. There are 90 students we can admit into the course. We have 6 faculty. We have lots of TFs. And this year we had maybe 150 students trying to get in the course. That's a robust number. These are freshmen, first-year students. They don't have to be in it. And that's, for me, a sign of the fact that the humanities are alive and kicking. So I'm, as I say, I don't want to exaggerate my good feeling. There's a lot of problems at Harvard, as you know. And in terms of the concentration, one real problem is that the Faculty of Arts and Sciences is tightening its belt for the obvious reasons. And one of the places it's tightening its belt is in the number of graduate students that we and the other humanities departments will be allowed to admit, because that's expensive for Harvard because they're fully funded. So we're likely, we've already had our cohort shrunk, and we're likely to have our cohort further diminished, and that actually is painful.
Yeah. Okay, and what is your perspective on the broader Harvard story? What's healthy? What's not healthy? If you had a magic wand, what would you do? Wave and do? What's going on?
I mean, the broadest Harvard story is that the university is actually having a very hard time. Much of the gigantic endowment is locked up. You can't just use it as a bank account to replace the gigantic amounts of federal money that is cut. The money is largely cut from, as you know, from the sciences and from the medical school labs. From my perspective, it would be very agreeable and desirable if a larger portion of the population realized that its MRIs, its CAT scans, its GPS all come from precisely university labs. They're not that, and that the cutting of the funds is actually quite disturbing. Not forget because Harvard is Harvard. It's disturbing because there's a national collective interest in having this work being done. I have a very good friend, Mark Kirshner, who is a very distinguished biologist who runs a lab, and he said that he was getting actually very close to important breakthrough in treating colorectal cancer, but he's had to stop. The funds have gone. The graduate students are turned away. This should concern us. Forget, as I say, we on this call, because we care about Harvard, are concerned about the university, but I am too, but I'm concerned about the larger picture for it's not, you can't just shut a lab down for 4 or 5 years and then you're going to turn it on again. The lights aren't going to go back on. That's not how it works. So the humanities are not affected that way because we don't depend upon federal funding. But the medical school laboratories, the science laboratories are affected. And I find this quite upsetting.
If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand or put them in the chat. I will read one. It's not much of a question, it's more of a comment, but it's very evocative for me. It's from Andrew Colville. It says, I was one of Professor Greenblatt's undergraduate students in 1993, and I remember a moment after class where he told a few of us about delaying law school to find your calling.
Oh, look at that. I'm still talking about it.
I really appreciate the advice to be patient, which is difficult for a Harvard student as it eventually allowed me to find my calling. Well, as somebody who did not take a class with Professor Greenblatt and went to law school, I would have appreciated having had that opportunity.
My father's a lawyer. My brother's a lawyer. My oldest son is a lawyer. My youngest son is going to be a lawyer. I'm surrounded by them.
Yes, same here. Trying to ward off the children, but all the family, yeah. So if there's one thing we should read from Christopher Marlowe, what is it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, legitimately the most famous play is Dr. Faustus, hence my Dancing with the Devil. I don't know if anyone on this call has ever read the extremely, I think, extremely interesting, powerful Spanish novelist called Javier Marias. Does anyone know the novelist Javier Marias? He was repeatedly nominated for the Nobel Prize. He's dead now. He died of COVID, but quite young. But terrific novelist, and he writes novels about the effect on your life of being a spy. He's really powerful novelist, and he's actually quite interested in Marlowe figures at a couple of points in his novels. But Javier Marias understands that there's something about committing yourself to being a spy that has a dangerous effect on your inner life, a tormenting effect on your inner life. It feels like a high when you start. It's exciting, it's adventurous, but it begins to eat away at you. And this was already, I think, grasped by Marlowe. The odd thing about Dr. Faustus is it has an incredibly powerful beginning with Faustus deciding to practice the dark arts. And then actually a lot of the play, and it's sort of annoying, a lot of the play seems kind of stupid because he can't do it. Right? He manages to slap the Pope across the face. He manages to play some tricks on people, but it's not actually very interesting. But I think that is actually Marlowe's point, that actually this deal, however alluring it seemed, however thrilling it seemed, actually begins to empty itself out in the course of the play. I think it's quite remarkable.
Okay, so then what is the meaning of life?
What is the meaning of life?
Yes.
Do you think that an English professor, an aging English professor, would have the?
I'm hoping.
The meaning of life is, I think, on the whole, I mean, I think in the case of Shakespeare, I think you could say, well, it's not the whole meaning of life, but you try to abjure cruelty. You understand that human cruelty is one of the most disgusting qualities in human beings, and you try to live a life that is not cruel. Marlowe actually was probably quite cruel. The things he's involved in are very ugly, I think, though he's also a genius. And the trick for someone like Marlowe, the paradox for someone like Marlowe, was it's probably the case that if Marlowe did what he was intended to do, namely go to a little parish somewhere in England and be an Anglican priest, he might have had a longer run of it, a longer life of it, but he wouldn't have realized any of these astonishing things were inside him. So his deciding to do something that was actually quite awful. I mean, I think he is betraying his friends. I think that's what his business was. Listening in on what his Catholic friends or what his radical Protestant friends were saying was part of a process in which he finally, some extraordinary power of genius emerged in him, but only for a few years before his life was snuffed out.
Okay, Ted Young asks, I read your book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, when you first published it. How would Marlowe fit into that notion?
Thank you. Well, Marlowe does fit into that book. Thank you. That was because there's a chapter on Marlowe in the book, on Marlowe and this kind of radical playfulness, in the sense of indifference to values, all values entirely. I don't think that was completely wrong. I mean, in fact, I think there's a certain amount of truth to it. But at that point, when I wrote this, I really didn't understand very much about what Marlowe had actually done with his life. I just thought of it as a kind of fantastic experiment in radical playfulness, just saying basically, I'll do anything I want. But I hadn't understood the complex web in which his life had become involved.
Any sneak peek into the next Stephen Greenblatt project?
No, I'm just at the very beginning of what the next one will be. So okay. Too early to say.
All right. Roger Green asks, could you comment?
I just want to say, Neil, that one of the things that you asked about Harvard now, we just had a faculty meeting in camera, so I wouldn't describe the various positions that were taken, we were talking about what to do about generative AI. And it's connected to your question of what the next thing I'm working on. For me, and I think for most of us, thinking is inseparable from writing. If you have the machine write for you, it's like having the machine go to the gym for you or make love for you. It's not actually a worthwhile experience. You don't get anything out of it. You have to actually do the writing. One of the things that is so alarming about generative AI now, and so difficult in terms of thinking how do we proceed, is that it's very, very tempting for everyone, for students, for lawyers, for lots of people under pressure of time, to turn to generative AI and have the writing done for them as if they could think independently of the writing. But it doesn't work that way. The writing is actually essential for the thinking, at least in my life. That's why I don't want to say anything about what I'm doing next, because it will only be when I do the writing that I'll know actually where I'm going to be.
Yeah. Roger Green says, could you comment on the possibility that Marlowe collaborated with Shakespeare on Richard III? And are there any parts of that play that remind you of Marlowe's style or language?
Absolutely. And there is speculation, as that question is asked, that Marlowe could have had his hand in Richard III. If he didn't have his hand in it, then in any case, Shakespeare, as he was repeatedly, was looking over his shoulder at Marlowe, because the Marlowe who writes, it's in an obscure play that Marlowe, basically the text is very damaged, that as Marlowe's plays, several of them, the texts are not very good. But there's a play called The Massacre of Paris about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that he wrote. The text is lousy. But there's a character called the Duke of Guise, who is very, very much like Richard III. If Marlowe didn't actually, I mean, it would be difficult for Marlowe to have had his hand directly in Richard III, because I think Marlowe was dead by the time Shakespeare, in my view, wrote it. But Shakespeare could have been thinking about it already. And it's very clear, as we said before, that Shakespeare was thinking about Marlowe. You know, one of my Yale teachers, Harold Bloom, the guy who said that Shakespeare invented the human and so forth and so on, said that Shakespeare was unique in having no anxiety of influence. But I think that's bullshit. I mean, Shakespeare was looking over his shoulder at Marlowe continually. And it happened that Marlowe died young when Shakespeare was only 29. And so he didn't have to look in the same nervous way. But I think he's thinking about Marlowe a lot.
Your AI commentary has provoked a couple questions. Mary Shu and Joan Trureese ask, would you elaborate on the AI advancement and your guidance to our younger generation? Can you share your imagination what the world will be like in 10 years now that we have AI? Is there a place for generative AI in research and creative endeavors such as writing?
Well, these are deep questions, and they're ones I have been thinking about. I mean, that AI will be enormously important in all our lives, and particularly in our children's lives, but also in our lives. There's no question about it. It is an extraordinary tool. And of course, it's easy to say that, well, that the kind of panic that people like Greenblatt is feeling at the moment is the kind of panic that people feel when a new device is brought in, the computer to begin with, the slide rule, or Socrates saying to his followers, writing is a terrible idea because it's going to destroy memory, and so forth. And in these cases, a new tool is brought in. It does change things, but humans figure out a workaround, and it only enhances their ability. So, okay, that would be the happy version of this. But I think generative AI is quite different this way, because AI will at least, at the moment, and it's only going to get better, it has the weird effect of seeming to think for you, and that it actually is very good at it. I mean, it's easy to say, well, look, these are only writing B papers. I don't think so. I think they're actually, the things I've seen and played with are very, very good. So first thing to say is that I am deeply concerned that that students who are under pressure, I think Harvard students are not, goes without saying, they're not stupid. They get that they're there because they want to learn. They can't have the machine just learn for them. But everyone's under pressure. They're doing a million different things. And I think that the temptation would be quite severe under pressure to turn to AI, even where you're not. There are places, of course, where it's extremely useful. And where you could be open about using it, but not in the humanities. In the humanities, that actually runs the risk of taking the place of thinking. Now, the question that was asked was about creative uses of AI, and I think this is a deep one. So let me say this. I'd say two things. First of all, now a couple of years ago in that freshman class that I teach, there was a very, very brilliant freshman who is a kind of AI genius. And he's a physics and computer science major, but he liked the class and he got very excited about it. And we got to talking, and he said, why don't we, he decided he would make a model of Montaigne's brain, a kind of bot, which he did by himself. And you could ask this bot questions, and the bot would spew out little essays that sounded like a little bit like Montaigne. It was actually pretty damn good. So I was kind of dazzled by this, and we chatted about it after the course was over. And we talked about his creating Shakespeare's brain. And lo and behold, the guy is fantastically good in a way, I should say, that Harvard students often are. Really, really very bright, amazing. And he not only, he created a kind of version of Shakespeare's brain that included everything that Shakespeare, not only everything Shakespeare wrote, of course, but everything Shakespeare may have read. So it actually is a kind of remarkable record of Shakespeare's brain. And I said, look, there's a missing play of Shakespeare, a play called Cardenio, that's lost. And we could have this thing make the play, create the play, and we can see what AI actually thinks a Shakespeare play sounds like. But thinking about doing this, I put the brakes on, much to the disappointment of my wonderful student. I put the brakes on because I thought, wait a minute, what am I doing? What exactly am I doing? My whole life, my whole career is about saying that the actual lived life of an artist is an essential part of the meaning of his or her work. If AI writes another Jane Austen novel, it's not really a Jane Austen novel, even if it sounds like Jane Austen. It's a fake. Or if my most powerful aesthetic experience in my life, was going into, as a very young man, going into a cave called Font de Gaume in France, in the Dordogne, and deep in the cave, seeing one of those paintings on the wall of a bison with, in those days, with just the light of a lantern. It just completely blew me away. But if you told me that that painting was made by AI, it would destroy my whole experience of it. It would be meaningless to me. So I thought, wait a second, stop. I don't want to go there. And now, not everyone feels this way. Larry Summers, whom some of you may know, and is a very good friend of mine, I love. Larry Summers says, look, if a painting by Van Gogh is a human good, then 5 paintings that look exactly like paintings by Van Gogh are 5 extra pieces of human good. So maybe that's true. I don't believe it. And this may all be unstoppable, but I would like to put the brakes on till we think about what we're doing ethically. Or not just ethically, what we're doing to what we human beings can actually do, almost uniquely.
All right, well, I look forward to the next book. We'll cut it off there. We could keep you forever. This has been fantastic. I do want to thank you for everything, right? For everything you've done to make the world a brighter place, to add scholarship, for spending your time graciously with us this evening. Really, really appreciate it. And we're
My
all
pleasure.
Greenblatt fans, so we're gonna keep in touch and watch.
Next time you're in Cambridge, all of you, be sure to be in touch.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Greenblatt.
Bye. Bye, Neil.
Bye-bye.